our last session of the last workshop that we had this week. But also, we want to say again that we are very thankful for the support that the graduate program in philosophy and philosophy of science have provided to organize this workshop and the one before. So we have as the last speaker one of the most talented graduate students that we have right now in the program. So Enrique Soto Astorga, he's going to fit this description. So I don't have to read the title completely. But, so you have something like half an hour, 40 minutes. I will let you know when you have spoken for half an hour.
Okay. I don't think I'll take that long. But
Perfect.
let's just everybody wants to go home. That's those of you who are not able to go home right now. But I'll try to be quick. Actually, I want to apologize because I believe this is one of the less substantial presentations. I've been very engaged by your what you have shared with us, and I actually feel that I'm just gonna do a small revision of things that I've been doing some research on for the last year or so, and then just trying to convince you that this is a way to do science. That means that this session will effectively become an ad for you, an advertisement, right? So just I'll try to be as consistent as possible. If there are any questions whatsoever during the presentation, please just stop me and say, hey, I didn't quite get that. And let's move forward. The title is just really fancy, just ignore it. And here's the abstract of the presentation. Let's just ignore it as well. Okay, so a long time ago, that is during the 1950s, no, maybe during the 1940s, there was a, Ukrainian rather, Nikolai Rashevsky, who after doing his PhD in theoretical physics, was invited to join Westinghouse at the US and to work on quantum physics. And afterwards, Dr. Rashevsky became a tenured professor at the University of Chicago. As you know, University of Chicago is located in Hyde Park, where Obama was born. Hyde Park was rebuilt over and over again, but it wanted one particular reconstruction, which was mostly done to change the sort of people who lived in Hyde Park. They wanted to have less racialized people and import other sorts of individuals. So the University of Chicago had to divert money from research programs to the rebuilding of the city. And one of the affected people was precisely Dr. Nikolai Rashevsky. He was very interested, first in aspects of physics, but after having a very heated conversation with a biologist, he decided to dedicate himself to the research of the living. And this happened because Rashevsky, I think it was at a party, was with a biologist, and let's say you are the biologist, right? And Rashevsky said, hey, do you think that the way that droplets spontaneously divide into two is the way that cells divide? And the biologist said, well, first and foremost, nobody can know because this is biology. And second, nobody will ever know. And Rashevsky, he labeled himself that the most stubborn Ukrainian ever, he was very pissed off and decided to pursue a career in biophysics. He created the first journal in mathematical biophysics, now known as a Journal of Biomathematics, and which he oversaw during, I think, his entire career. But during some time of pursuing a reductionistic answer to why organisms are the way they are and why cells divide, he came to, face a moment of change in his career. Less importantly, because he found no results using physics, and secondly, because Hyde Park needed the money from the University of Chicago, so he needed to somehow make sure that his research program and laboratory would survive. So he changed the narrative and said, no, you know what? Biology cannot be reduced to physics. So he effectively discarded a lot of years of work he had done and decided to engage in a very different direction. When he did so, he tried to focus on not the way that organisms are built based on the nature of the materials, that is, the building blocks of the organisms, but rather how they are interconnected. This will sound very familiar to those doing philosophy of the mind, because it resounds with functionalism. Well, it is very much alike. During his time as the head of the Laboratory of Mathematical Biophysics, Reshevsky received as a student somebody called Robert Rosen. Rosen was the first obtained the first PhD in relational biology, which was ever granted in the US and, of course, the rest of the world, because nobody knew what that was. And in this lab, Rosen, who was already very much in love with the research of what organisms are, became convinced that the way that Reshevsky was approaching the matter was the correct one. Just as a piece of data, Reshevsky was also the mentor of many other people, but amongst them of Walter Pitts. And Reshevsky is actually the originator of the ideas of artificial neural networks, of the perceptron, that is. Walter Pitts obtained that from sessions like this one with Reshevsky. So that was one of the attempts of Reshevsky to explain at least the mind, amongst many other phenomena of the living, using the physical. But of course, afterwards that changed. So Rosen was, groomed within this sort of intellectual school. And due to that same reason, Rosen dedicated his entire life, which ended abruptly during the 90s, alas, to the formalization of the living. But to that end, Rosen wrote a plethora of texts, most of them dealing with modeling, the way that we model the objects of nature. We have this, what we call the holy triad of Rosenian work. The first one is called Fundamentals of Measurement and Representation of Natural Systems, which of course sounds very much like what I just said, modeling of natural systems. Then he dedicated himself to the notions of anticipation. He believed that organisms are what they are because they can effectively model the world and themselves in a surrogate time that runs a little bit faster than natural time, so that I can do predictions without causing causality, that is affecting natural causality. And then the third book, which was written before he died, Life Itself, is his opus magnum, where he relates what an organism is. All of this was built on top of relational biology. And I would like to say, well, what is relational biology? Well, first, it's a rejection of the then predominant analysis of systems based on the idea that dividing them in parts, analyzing those parts and how they work, and then putting them back together is enough to understand a thing. And the big assertion of relational biology and relational scientists is that there are certain kinds of systems that cannot ever be divided and then recovered from the division. That is, there is no analysis to be made on them, which can yield complete knowledge of what that system is, effectively. The traditional thing that we get from dividing something and then putting it all back together and making it work again is a mechanism, the clock, the clock and then the clockwork universe, right? People who pursue computationalist explanations of the universe, like David Deutsch or Stephen Wolfram, believe that to some extent there is some way to obtain a potentially finite and discretized set of things that make the universe tick and work as it should. But relational scientists reject that in the basis that to them, there are certain things that do not behave that way, and those things are very much alive. So I'm going to delve into that. Of course, I want to just go a bit ahead of myself and say that the general notion of structure that relational biologists will have will not depend on what physics can provide you with, but with the networks of relationships that exist between components, no matter what their nature is. Okay, so one interesting thing that Rosen noted is that although biology has been very interesting to do as a science during a lot of time after it was born from naturalistic philosophy, it cannot ever stop being a parasite of other disciplines. The explanations of the living come from other disciplines, not from biology itself. Okay, first it was an automaton, so living things are automata. Now there's a computer, then living things are the manifestation of code, of genetic code being instantiated into organisms, and so on and so on. So Rosen was very much pissed off because he was a biologist and a mathematician. Alas, he was not a philosopher. And he said, well, then what makes biology stand on its own feet? There is no reason to defend biology as a discipline. It's just a subset of pretty terms that we can use to define some stuff that is interesting within the realm of physics. But really, if it can now ultimately be reduced to physics, then there is no reason to study the living apart from the non-living. And so Rosen, and on top of Reshevsky's shoulders, decided to pursue a relational explanation, well, a relational principle of organization. And that is, whereas in mechanistic biology, organization, let's say our bodies, are a consequence of mechanistic phenomena such as genetic coding, in relational biology, organization is the general explanans of everything else. As a consequence, which I will not delve into this time, Rosen mentions that evolution itself is of no importance because it's a corollary of organization. So that's very strong. The other stronger claim, which is at the end of the final book of Rosen, which I will not defend today, and if you ask any questions about it, I'll just ignore it, is that physics is a subset of biology, and that biology is the more general science. Of course, when you take biology to be about relations and not about matter, well, yes, but maybe that's not biology anymore. Okay, let's move forward. So the first tool that Rosen uses and develops throughout his life is the modeling relation. And this comes in alignment with a lot of things that have been discussed today. Rosen says that usually in science, what we will do is take the percepts that a natural system provides us with, associate them with qualities of the natural system which we cannot directly observe, and then formalize them, encode them into a formal system so that we can do things within that formal system without depending on the time in which the natural system is actually running. That is, imagine yourselves trying to do an experiment on evolutionary biology. Okay, let's wait out for everybody to die, and then to reproduce, and then over and over again. Well, maybe if we had a sort of world in which we could do that without the constraints of time, that would be ideal. And that is where Rosen believes that mathematics comes into play. We formalize stuff so that we can do manipulations without the passage of time being a burden. And then the art of good modeling is being able to decode whatever inferential entailment happens in the formal system into predictions of the natural system. Or if you are an engineer or a god, you might as well decode them back as realizations of your formal system. An architect will decode their Bauplan into the building. A cell will decode its genomic code into another cell. That's pretty much it. Now, Rosen says that, in effect, nobody actually does that correctly, and that it happens mostly due to the fact that we formalize into a very specific set of mathematics, subset of mathematics, which is that of propositions. Rosen analyzes in his book on anticipatory systems with very much detail what's the difference between the world of mathematics of structures and that of propositions. He says, you know what? The world of propositions is a world of symbols, which depend on rules that apply on those symbols, which are just as meaningless as the symbols themselves. You're learning about manipulating symbols, and that's great. But manipulation of symbols does not decode back to reality, not even to predictions of reality. They might align somewhat, but they are not actually about the natural system itself. Maybe there is another way to encode to some sort of mathematics which deals not with symbols, but with structures. And that's where Rosen discovers category theory, where he says, oh, look, this is not about the symbols themselves. Of course, there are symbols, there are arrows. Rosen accepts that in the end, these are formal systems, they are about form, but the manipulation within a categorical theoretical diagram is not about manipulating symbols, but about the relationships between those symbols embedded in the diagram. Most importantly, Rosen says that biology has suffered, as many other sciences he mentions, from the malinformament of the mathematical machines, such as the Turing machine, as a form of formalizing. So he says, okay, if I formalize something, a natural system, into a formal system, and then I use a mathematical machine to understand that mathematical system, which is the way that the Turing machine was actually invented. This was about mathematics. The Turing machine, lambda calculus, the post formulation one system, all of those were about decision problems, about mathematics. Oh, that's nice. That's okay. What Rosen says is that biology has been subject to a direct encoding to the machine metaphor. Nobody remembers anymore that it's actually about the mathematics and not about things being machines. So he says, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong is that there are sorts of natural systems that do not behave the way that mathematical machines do. And to that end, he'll conduct a relational analysis of both. And to that end, we must lay out the rudiments of relational biology. So it will all depend on the notion of function. You observe a natural system, and you understand which parts of it function for whatever end. If you take them out, the system no longer functions as it should. Not about the materiality, but about the presence of a sort of network of entailments. So, of course, that means that in natural systems, there must be some sort of finality. Not as I am here to engrace you all with this knowledge. No. I built this presentation so that you can learn from it something, maybe, or criticize me until I am dead. I don't know. But there's a finality. I don't know really which one it is, right? And then we can create components, that is, start to compartmentalize the system based on functions that they serve. This is very much like functionalism. So Rosen will then say that components themselves, that is, collections of functions, are the basic units of organization, on the contrary of, in Newtonian science, being that the particle. All right, so Rosen, based on Rajewski, designs full language for relations, which is, of course, category theory in disguise. And then, because I have nothing better to do, I design my own flavor of the language. This diagram says F induces the whatever change must happen so that A becomes B. This represents Rosen's commitment to Aristotelian causation. Since Rosen is using relational biology to study organisms, and he believes that organisms have some sort of teleology embedded in them, he believes that he can describe the way that metabolism works using these diagrams. So we should call F, let me see if this appears in the other, yes. F can be understood as the efficient cause of the transformation of material cause A into a set of final causes B. And you might as well say that the entirety of the diagram is the formal cause of this relation. This is very much useful to understand metabolism. This has been used in a diversity of papers to explain how certain metabolic networks work. But the general idea of Rosen is we don't really care what's the nature of F, nor of B, nor of A, nor B. What we care about is the sort of relation that exists between them. F is related to A as a processor, and A is related to B as the material cause of this, right? So Rosen's entire analysis depends on this sort of diagrams, which of course will eventually converge to category theoretical graphs. Rosen's idea was never to be talking about the properties of category theory for the real world. He was not saying, yeah, oh yeah, there's a functor there. There's a functor, there's a Cartesian product graph. No, he wasn't really concerned about transferring the properties of mathematics to the world. He was concerned about which formalism was the most similar one to capture how causation occurs in nature, how relation between things that can be causally efficacious to other, I'm going to touch this one, can be captured. I can, of course, create a predicate about this cup being pushed by my hand. But to Rosen, a diagram of efficient causation would be much more natural to exemplify how my hand caused this cup to move from point A to point B. Of course, there are a lot of things that category theory provides Rosen with, but he sort of ignores them because he doesn't want to go deep into the mathematics. He wants to say that it's rather not about the manipulation of symbols, but about the representation of structural relationships, what biology should be about. And that is in direct contrast with the way that molecular biologists handle, let's say, equations of reactions. His prized possession or result is the diagram which represents life. Just as a very quick addendum to this talk, let me see just how much time I've left there. 10 minutes. What Rosen finds is that in order for things to be alive, they must be able to cause themselves. Efficient causes must be contained within the things themselves, unless there is a divine hand providing whatever you need from the outside. Of course, there are things you need from the outside because we are not closed thermodynamical systems. We require food. Yes, we require building blocks, but the building blocks themselves do not create the relationships. The relationships are somehow immanent to organisms. And they are immanent because we cause them. We continuously make sure, well, I don't, but my cells, I guess, make sure that whatever is necessary for a relationship to be preserved is preserved. That is, organizational invariance is a consequence of being alive. So, as I mentioned earlier, Rosen was very interested in the way that we can do modeling. And while he says that molecular biology using mechanistic approach to symbol manipulation is a good model because it yields results, he would say that the actual model of the living, the one that actually can be decoded back to a natural system, is this thing. Now, what I don't fully believe nor endorse is that Rosen would have said that such a thing exists by itself, that we are instantiations of that blueprint. What he would have said is that this diagram is the best we can do to understand how the living is built. With all the limitations of our cognitive apparatus, with the limitations of perception, and with a lot of phenomenological assumptions that he does along his career, he would say that this is the best we can do. Not the molecular mechanistic approach, but the relational one. The problem with this, of course, is that there is no time factored in. This is very much Platonistic. It's there, right? Here is a cell. This is a cell. I even draw it so that you can see the nucleus and the membrane, because the original diagram is a horrid triangle, but this one is pretty. But I don't agree that this is a cell. I do agree, though, that the relational approach yields a much more compelling retelling of why we are the way we are. But that doesn't mean that that can be decoded back to an experimentally interesting project, which is the issue with this sort of analysis. And I will not bore you with the details. He also conducts an analysis of mechanisms, systems that do not behave like cells, that is, that do not have this sort of self-causing entailments. That is, systems that can be finitely built onto a maximal model that can then be encoded using the modeling relation to a certain sort of formal system, particularly Turing's mathematical machine, which can then be understood in a relational diagram as something that depends on a material substrate, which we call hardware, and which transforms inputs into outputs. Rosen's work produces a very good framework for the ontological discussion of the stance of the hardware-software division, which is debatable in philosophy of computing, but it's something that I am very passionate about. Right? So, okay, Rosen's work was very much obscured by two big factors. A, he made enemies with everybody. He didn't care about convincing others. He was only concerned with reporting his findings. He attended symposia, yes. He was the president of the International Society for ISSS, International Society for System Science. And he did a lot of work at the Center for Democratic Institutions, but otherwise he tried not to deal with his peers because his peers actually throw dirt on him and Rashevsky for personal reasons. That is documented. It's very sad. But recently, the revival of organicism has taken Rosen as an interesting structure to avoid an interesting answer to the question of the ignorance of the structure beneath the organization of the living. Matteo Mosio's book on organization in biology is a very good example of that. Then we have people who have, I'm so sorry, this is way too small, but people who have worked on papers like Earth's complexity is non-computable, trying to argue why certain aspects of ecology cannot be captured by mechanistic approaches using Rosen as an explanation. And somebody published this in Synthesis. So this is a very good friend of mine, Marcus Wegström. And he tried to do a build between natural law, the way that Rosen approaches modeling, and perspectivism. So Rosen is in very much every place. A good friend of mine, Francisco Vergara Silva, he's a tenured researcher at the Institute of Biology, just went to Europe to a workshop in honor of Conrad Waddington. And the first thing that was mentioned was that after that society had invited Waddington back in the day, the second person who was invited was Rosen, because they were interested in the things that he had to say. But what worries me a bit is what sort of ontological commitments Rosen had in mind when working on this. And apparently he had none. Like he couldn't care a bit about the philosophy behind all of this. It was like, yes, mathematics is a work of the mind during the 1980s. Then during the 1990s, he said, no, these diagrams exist by themselves. They have an existence of their own. And then he died. So it is my job to try to clarify this. What I wanted to bring to this table today is that there is a take on the structure of the living, which does not depend on symbol manipulation, which depends on relations, and which then can be translated into the theoretical tool of category theory, and which at the same time provides good substance to why things are the way they are, without depending on doing explanations on very specific cases of why certain organisms couple with the environment this way, sometimes, or some others don't. That's an issue that, for instance, Varela and Maturana faced with the notion of structural coupling. Why certain things better behave in certain substrates and others do not? In any case, I would very much like to say that Rosen's take, if ignoring full-blooded Platonism, which I really want to do because I don't want to believe that, Rosen's idea is a good case for epistemic and ontological structural realism. And this is because, first, in the first two books, Rosen claims that this is a way to understand how things are built, but not how they are. That is, the first part of his opus, let's say the first two-thirds, are in the epistemic range. Then life itself is, to my taste, the first ontological commitment that Rosen does on a sort of structure being necessary for organisms to exist. He says that the structure, which is the diagram, this little sphere here, is natural law. I like to tell my students at the School of Science, just imagine that if the universe is myself, then all laws that the universe must behave under are tattooed on the back. And right here is that diagram. So life must happen that way. It cannot be in any other way. I don't clearly see that. I couldn't. That's one of the things that we cannot defend, because I cannot go at the back of the universe and see what sort of tattoos it has. I can just speculate about them. But what I do like about this is that, at least for biology, this becomes a first building block. This becomes a first principle without depending on those of physics directly. Finally, this is the last slide. I would like to do the same ad that Andres did. So if you want to know more, here's my master's thesis. What I do, since I am a philosopher of computing, what I do is a criticism of Rosen's notion of mechanisms from a perspective of axiomatic computability. Nobody knows whether all computational models are the same. The Church-Turing thesis is a thesis. It is a dogma. But Wilfried Sieg, based on the work of Robin Gandy, who was Turing's only doctoral student, did a very good work in saying, hey, maybe we just need some sort of axioms to say what the computer is and what is not. We don't need a thesis. Whatever instantiates these axioms or is logically derived from these axioms is a computer. So that's the work I do, but I do break down the principles of Rosen. And finally, there is interest in this. Back in May, I organized what is now the first international conference on anticipatory systems and Rosenian complexity. And we had a lot of people. The second edition will happen in Puerto Varas in Chile. If you want to attend, it's free. We never charge for conferences. But the important thing is that most of us were not actually biologists. So we still need, it's obvious that biologists are still not engaged with this, which is obvious because what I told you, well, this little thing here is kind of difficult to understand in terms of biology, right? Well, okay, and now what? What do I do with this? How can I experiment with this? There is a man in Spain trying to instantiate a cell using this, and apparently he's having some success, but he's 98 years old, so God knows. Thank you so much.
The slide says questions, Octavio. Address them.
Thank you. This is really interesting. So I think I can see why biologists are resisting, right? Because they tend to be very particularists by and large, right? And looking at specific contexts, very skeptical of big abstractions by and large, right? So and category theory would be very bizarre for them, right? Yes. I can see that, right? And so now one question, right, is one thing is to represent abstractly some structure. That's category theory is perfect, right? To do that, especially relation among structures. It was designed to do that, right? And but when you consider what explains what, right? So in a biological context, biologists would say, well, those explanations involve the relevant causes, right? Whatever is in the mechanisms and which are abstract away. Because what you have is just a sort of a relation, right? And so then, how can you do biology?
That's a very good question that was posed a long time ago. So the answer that relational biologists would give you is that the current way of doing biology is wrong. That you shouldn't even care about which part of the biological mechanism gets dissoluted in these sort of explanations, because you'll get something else. Of course, what that something else is, nobody has ever done. So we don't have the example, right? We're no longer talking about osmosis. What are we talking about? Diagrams. Okay, so that's precisely the pain point in all of this. There is a promise of that something will be yielded by this approach, which will make the understanding of the living different from the mechanistic approach, which is currently based on the mechanisms of the cell being where they are and doing what they're supposed to do. But the general idea behind relational biology is that those will disappear. Not that you won't see the mitochondria anymore, but that you won't be needing to understand just how many electrons go in and go out, just the fact that it is related to something else and that relation is enough. What relational biologists would argue is that certainly maybe the cell is not counting just how many electrons come in or out. It's the fact that there are things that coupled can manipulate them, what makes a cell structurally invariant. So, to my understanding, that would not be biology as it is today. That's why they call it relational biology. They accept that it is an entirely different monster.
The way is that if that monster may abstract away.
That's right.
Too much of the phenomena you're trying to.
That's right. Many people like what's his name, Jan Hofmeyr and Howard Patti himself. They have mentioned that Rosen's framework is incomplete, and it is. Rosen died prematurely due to diabetes before he wrote the second part of the book, which was apparently the one in which he would devote his time to understand which modules of the cell can be captured by which sort of diagrams. I have the draft, and it does provide some light, but it's incomplete. It's not even the half of the entire idea. So the thing is that most of relational biologists have tended towards or gravitated towards explaining what sort of category MR systems, which is the diagram that I showed here, are in. Okay, that's nice for the mathematician, but what about the biologists? So not many biochemists are working on this, but there is one interesting paper, which uses the formalism to expand a complete metabolic network, and it's rather successful. So it appeals more to biologists, saying, okay, yes, this is abstract nonsense, as Wikipedia would say, category can be referred to as, but it fits. It's just way too early to see useful representation of this, but it is necessary. Otherwise, biologists will never take this into account.
So, I'm going to repeat the list. There is Andres, then Alexander, then Fernanda. Andres and Esteban.
I know you said you wouldn't answer these kinds of questions. I'm just trying to picture an example. I do not want to discuss if physics is reductive to biology.
Oh, I don't want to.
I just want to picture how would that be. So if you take, for example, the standard model of particles, would the bosons be the functions, the primary things, and then leptons and anything else? Or we should take maybe Feynman diagrams, or are we going to Carnap's formulation of properties?
That's a very, very good question. I don't have the answer to that. I am fully ignorant. I mean, I don't have the necessary toolkit to answer the question. But what I can also tell you is that nobody has dedicated time to that. That's important. And it is an open question that Rosen knew about. He writes on that on a book called Essays on Life Itself, which is a collection of things that he wrote before he died. And himself being a mathematician and a physicist, he knew that there was a need for him to explain what sort of substrate life was depending on. But he rejected that substrate being physics. Like, it's a very, very strong commitment that he does at the end of his life. Again, it's like Putnam. Right? Just like Putnam had 7 different personalities across his life, Rosen had 3. And we tend to focus on the last one because that's the most explosive one. Life is uncomputable. Live organisms are not machines. My diagram is live. And the rest of you can just ignore yourselves out and let the room be for myself. That's what Rosen, the final Rosen, would say. But the Rosen of the first 2/3 of his life would have been concerned with that question, which he recovers by the end of his time in this terrible earth. So that is one of the open tasks, which, of course, if you are open to some extra work, we could discuss that. I am definitely open to more work, if you'd like.
There are many questions. Let's be concise, everybody.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know much about category theory, but I had the idea that you need a collection of morphisms and a collection of objects.
Yes.
There is. What kind of objects and morphisms do you think that is necessary for the diagram of the lead of cell? And why we cannot use CTR as an example to represent functions and sets to make a diagram, a similar diagram?
Okay, so those diagrams assume, in terms of Rosenian take of life, that objects are substrates of some nature and morphisms are chemical transformations. Now, set theory is at the bottom. Those are sets. The objects are sets of different biomolecules.
Set? Oh, yes. And there are functions.
Yes.
Okay, and you can use make a category for subsets and
Enzymes.
And enzymes, because in some axiomatic category versions of the category theory, you need to satisfy some actions to be a category. You think that enzymes and some subsets could satisfy that definition of category and not treat like a set?
That's right. I do believe that, and I've read that. So yes.
Thank you.
Great. So, Fernanda.
If
No.
it's true that Rosen claims that organisms are not machines and biology cannot be reduced to physics.
Right.
However, he feels like he wants to use these formal sciences as physics to model biology. And I was wondering what Andrew Bergson would feel about it. because I love this quote when he says, like, mathematicians have the worst possible way to approach to nature, because they fail to grasp our complex, capacities as memory, smells, and so on. So, what would Rosen say? If his diagram is able to.
Anticipatory Systems, which is the second book, is a very naive treatise of philosophy of science, which is rather phenomenological. He builds the idea of how we can perceive natural systems, how we create science upon them, and how we impute relationships between observables, even though those relationships might not exist, yet we do science with those. He would say that to the extent of his understanding of how we perceive it, his explanation is the most parsimonious. But as I have said, biologists do not feel that way. So I would think that by this time he would have been 101, I guess. He would have accepted that his approach was very obscure, just like any other mathematical approach, which depends on a deep list of equations. And I guess that he would have devoted himself to making that a little bit more accessible to the human experience, to the way that we are built as perceptive beings. But he stopped there. He died.
Yeah, no, so as brief as possible, but it's just this thing you said is a little bit like functionalism. Now, I wonder how this relates to, let's call it, if there's such a thing, the mainstream view of biology among biologists and among philosophers of biology. Like everyone agrees that biology is a complex science, like many others, like sociology. It doesn't deal directly just with atoms and molecules, although there's parts of biology try to bridge the gaps, right? Like molecular biology. Now, these systems obviously have to be analyzed functionally in some way. They have different components that play different roles, that keep homeostasis, and that, and now that's kind of uncontroversial that there's a certain level of organization that you need to describe to explain what is life, right? But that's not really controversial, I think, right? Now, then there's a debate about the metaphysical relationship between the levels, right? I mean, and also on the explanatory ones, like, is there some kind of non-reductive relation between the organization of the whole and its parts? And that's all very interesting, but it doesn't entail that there don't have to be parts and that at some levels you can bridge the gaps, like molecular biology tries to do, right? Right. So, for instance, in any form of functionalism, there has to be a realizer for each function. That's right. And to be a realizer, is going to be an explained at the lower level, that's usually assumed. Now, if you break that down, you break the unity of science, and it seems like potentially very little convincing. But I mean, there's these powerful arguments for a certain unity of science, the supposed causal closure of the physical world, etc., etc. But now, of course, there's people that are willing to say no, there could be downwards causation from upper levels of organization, but very few people are willing to bite that bullet. Of course, that's exactly what you didn't want to engage in, but that's right. A little uncomfortable and saying, well, maybe, we live in a magical reality, but perhaps not.
I take your question and your comment on heart because that's one of the things that bugs me. But I do believe that the question that Rosen trying to answer is of importance in biology in the sense that organization can be perceived, but we never really truly understand what makes it tick, right? So to understand a cell, you need to kill it. You destroy it. You sonicate it. You break it into parts, and then where's the organism? So molecular biology and trying to understand organisms kind of goes away, misses the organism entirely. So the question about organization for Rosen is, okay, that's fine. That creates vaccines, right? We have antibiotics thanks to that sort of science. But that science is not enough to explain why things are the way they are. Now, what sort of level, where is this organizing principle located at? That's something that we will discuss at a later date. But I do agree with Rosen that it has an eminent place, that it's not just epiphenomenal.
You have a follow-up or is
It's just a comment.
okay?
I think you raise an important point here, and I think to some extent biologists are concerned with the fact that sometimes to study the cells you have to kill them and create these highly artificial environments to study. But they also develop tools to avoid that, right? So there are microscopes that allow you to observe cells in vitro, right? So you want to see whatever it is that they are doing while they're doing their thing, right? Which is an attempt to say, look, let's not go so idealized. Let's look at how they are functioning.
Yes.
So,
but I do not live in a microscope. That is the fact. The fact is that Rosa would say that the instrument itself is at some level breaking down the organism. So if you want to inspect my hand, I would need to put my hand in the microscope. If you wanted to look at one of my blood vessels, you would somehow need to be able to actually see it without interference, without breaking organization. So if you, let's say, take a sample out of my hand, that is not my hand anymore. It is an organism, yes, but it's decoupled from whatever place it was at, and it might not behave as it should. So the assumption that it's behaving as it should is a bold one.
yeah, but go in stages. Right? So an electron microscope, you need to slice the cell, express it, and so. But some optical microscope allow you to see some of these cells in vivo.
Yes,
Right.
very learning.
So, it's better, right? So, sure, I cannot just look at the cells in your hand with a naked eye. And my eye's not fine-grained enough to do that, right? But you're getting better at designing technologies that allow to study the objects in their environment.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the first Rosen would have agreed too. He would have said, I'm just trying to provide a theoretical framework for what we are observing, not rejecting the progress of science. The final Rosen, on the other hand, would have said, doesn't matter. Why? Well, Howard Patti has his opinions. It seems that he was trying to say the most possible with the little time that he had left. He had already kidney failure. I have pictures of him. He was in a really bad situation. I can show them all here. And no, but the fact is that Rosen was in a rush. So he might have said the things he said because he felt he had no time. And that's why I prefer to read the late Rosen under the light of the old one, where physics is still an important dimension of the dialogue. No.
Okay,
Okay.
so Maria.
That's nice.
What?
I already answered your question.
Yeah, so like for their class.
Yeah.
So I have two questions.
Yeah.
Do not feel the need to answer them in deep. Most of them are just exploratory. The first one is, we get it. Rosen didn't thought of any philosophical diagram or explanation, but I do want to ask you, what kind of ontology do you think that the anticipatory systems is endorsed by?
Okay.
From what scientific point of view?
Okay.
But she has a second question.
I was looking for that.
Two more. Yeah. The second is, it's largely why perspectival realism. The third one, which is a little bit to push you.
To the edge.
To the edge,
Okay.
yes. Why are diagrams not computable? I mean, I think, is maybe because all of the possibilities that are there, the only categories, whatever, but if we take into account recent technological processes such as AI, which are capable of evaluating all of this information, it kind of seems that, or it seems possible to me that we could compute these diagrams.
Okay, let me answer the last question first. First thing, no, we couldn't, because AI is still built on finitistic, symbol manipulating models such as the Turing machine or whatever is beneath your programming language, be it lambda calculus, for instance. And the fact is that Rosen's theory of machines, which is his attempt at formalizing what machines actually are without using the church Turing thesis of believing that all of them are the Turing machine, no matter what they are like, he proves that mechanisms are finite, just as algorithms, and that if you have a finite collection of mechanistic elements, there is at most one maximal model in which they can be accommodated in. There is no infinite machine, which is absolutely congruent with the rest of computing theory. Then Rosen shows that his diagram for the living depends on a loop that implies that there must be an infinite descent of parts or an infinite model on top. And that is because mechanisms, being finite, need somebody to build them. There must be an external fabricator. There is an external efficient cost, just as chairs do not fabricate themselves. This would be a mechanism for Rosen. If this was alive, it would have enough entailment to make itself happen. So if I broke this, maybe tomorrow we would have another one or two. So that's the reason why organisms are not machines, because they diagrammatically have a loop that implies that the diagram is causing itself. It's an infinite regress, so to speak, and mechanisms forbid that. And he does that using theoretical computer science and the basis of which Turing laid out to say, hey, there is no way for machines to be infinite, because that was one of the requirements of Hilbert. The description must be finite. So organisms, if described computationally, must be infinite, which, of course, lends itself to hyper-computational approaches. Maybe there are machines which can deal with infinites. There are a couple of examples, like Turing machines that you place at very specific space-times around black holes that can compute on computable numbers. The fact is that you cannot go and extract the result. So, but that's what Rosen would have said. And large language models are still computational artifacts. So one piece of advice is, let's not confound simulation with realization. And the second question was, why perspectivism? Because the entirety of anticipatory systems is a treaty of why science deals with natural systems the way it does, you being a geologist, or you being a biologist, or you being a physicist. You're not saying the same, well, you're saying the same thing, but you're not characterizing it the same, because different aspects of it are encoded differently in your models. And the fact is that there must be a way to make all of these models like coexist, make them unified. And this guy, Marcus Weckström, believes that Rosen's idea of modeling can lend itself to perspectivism as a theoretical underpinning. And the first question was the ontology. I think that he was a structural realist. And what about me? I am what I am. I would say no.
It's good if you're not what you're not.
No, I think that I like to think of myself as
yes, but
I like to think of myself as an individual who cannot make any mathematical commitments, such as structures existent by themselves. But I do believe that what we can know about reality is about structures. But I don't think that they exist beyond time and space. Or if they do, I do not live there, so I couldn't verify that. Okay, but that's something in development. I'm still an egg, right? I'm hatching right now.
So we have a few more minutes, and I have a question.
Yes.
You said that what matters in this case is the road or the relation, right? Not the nodes that are connected, not the specific materiality of those nodes. But it's very weird, at least in my very basic chemistry, to think that the materiality of those nodes doesn't inform which relations can form between them.
Well, that's a different stance, right? Because I mean, that would be what the materialist would say, and Rosen would say no. Because from the materiality of that, you cannot infer the relations completely every time. And a chemist would say, actually, you can, right? I mean, that's what chemistry is about. But what Rosen would be referring to as a relation is the organizational invariance of me being a cell, being what I am continuously. And what he says is the symbol manipulation of reaction formulas in chemistry does not entail the necessary meaning of organization. There must be something else. I am not rejecting that happens. And that actually happens within the relation. That equation of material change that chemistry explains is considered within the relation. It's part of the transformation. But the fact is that the transformation exists in a network. Why that network and not some other network? Why are we not dissipating every time? Well, we are slowly. But why are we not actively, violently dissipating, as when people believed that there was some sort of combustion that would happen out of nowhere? Spontaneous combustion, that was, you remember that? It was a meme. So why not that? Why this? Why a sort of permanence during some time? So Rosen wouldn't have rejected chemistry. He would have said that chemistry does not entail organization, but that organization entails the sort of chemical reactions that happen within organisms. That's it.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
if there are no more questions, let's thank staying so long and so bravely here. See you next time. Sorry.